This is HuffPost Live. I'm Mike Sachs. Female sexual predators are often depicted as objects of teenage fantasy in popular culture and current events. But this reaction ignores reality. Although women may not be predators nearly as often as men, for the victims of rape or sexual assault, the perpetrator's gender doesn't detract from the gravity or trauma of the offense. Here to discuss this with me, I'm joined in the Google Hangout by Curtis St. John. He is Director of Communications at malesurvivor.org. We have Dean Esme, Managing Editor for AVFM, and was sexually abused by more than one woman when he was younger. We have James Landreth, a rape survivor, and we have Dr. Wendy Walsh, psychotherapist and human behavior expert. So Curtis, I want to go to you first. In the overall numbers of sexual assault, how common is it for a woman to be a sexual predator upon a man?
Well, that's more of a hidden issue because it's not really reported. Many men deny the fact that it affected them at all. And it's a challenge for men to even report about male abuse, let alone female abuse. So the numbers are well hidden, unfortunately.
And for those that we do know in the stories that we have heard, how does it affect the men who have been sexually assaulted or raped by women? Is the trauma similar to what we see for male on female sexual assault and rape?
Yeah, it's very similar. Growing up, I was sexually abused as a child by male, and I grew up saying that happened when I was a kid, but I'm fine. And I never was able to put the root cause of the abuse to my issues of anger and alcohol. However, what I was seeing now is it's double hard for a male who is abused by female to admit this. They'll never be able to connect the cause because a lot of the media is still calling them lucky.
Yeah, and there was a study that Dean provided in our comments section as we were getting ready for the segment when we were still in the green room. It gave some statistics. I have it pulled up on my computer. One highlighted here is 86% of the victims of female sexual predators aren't believed, so their crimes go unreported and don't get prosecuted. Now, this was a study that came out over a decade ago, but I imagine that dynamic hasn't really improved too much. But Dean, I know that you've come out and told your story, as has James. I'm curious to hear your story, Dean.
Well, I try not to go into too many graphic detail just because I don't want other living people that could be hurt or whatever. But yeah, I'm managing editor at A Voice for Men. That's not just AVFM, A Voice for Men, where we published a piece which I'll be happy to share with you guys by a guy named Keith who was in a foster home where all the boys there were abused by the women who ran it. In my particular case, when I was 15, I was a runaway with nowhere to live, and I wound up being taken in by somebody who was helping me and became, well, by all accounts, by all legal measures, it was statutory rape, and it went on for several years. It significantly impacted my relationships with women, my self-image, my idea of what was normal or not normal in sexual relations, even gave me certain levels of sexual shame. And I get very used to seeing these sorts of things laughed at, and I don't think it's funny. I really don't. I remember recently watching a piece, not that they're here to defend themselves, but Cenk Uygur over on the Young Turks has a habit of laughing when stories like this come on the news, and they're not the only ones. There's this assumption that boys are just asking for it. Who would ever say that, 15, 16, 17-year-old girl, well, she was asking for it, but we laugh and we act like that's cool, like male sexuality is cheap and there's no emotion involved, and if you're 17 years old, you're not confused, and everything's wrong with it.
Yeah.
And our cultural attitudes about it. And I think it is very underreported. Every source I've seen shows it to be underreported.
And is the underreporting, does that come from this notion, even among men, that's been internalized, that male sexuality is cheap, that it's a blow to one's masculinity to have been taken advantage of by a woman or even another man?
Well, erections aren't, I hate to say it, but erections aren't voluntary. So if you tell a female rape victim, well, you found your body doing certain involuntary things to cooperate, does that mean you really wanted it? And that would be a horrible thing to say to a female rape victim. Yet we routinely assume that a boy or man, even young man who gets into a relationship like that, it was all voluntary. Yeah, he wanted it. Yeah, no. I don't know if I answered your question or not. Maybe someone else has some input on that, but
Yeah, I'm curious also. I have from Curtis from your website malesurvivor.org. I have several myths that you've put up, and myth number 7 is if the perpetrator is female, the boy or adolescent should consider himself fortunate to have been initiated into heterosexual activity. In reality, premature or coerced sex, whether by a mother, aunt, older sister, babysitter, or other female in a position of power over a boy, causes confusion at best and rage, depression, or other problems in more negative circumstances. To be used as a sexual object by a more powerful person, male or female, is always abusive and often damaging. Now, James, I want to go to you as well. I know. Can I first hear? How's your audio?
Good, I can hear just fine.
Oh, great, and I can hear you perfectly as well. So thank you for joining us. I know that your story also involves a good amount of burying what happened down within you, not really coming out with your story for some time. But if you're able to share what happened to you and why you were able to come out and speak about what happened to you, what motivated you to do so?
Well, it was time. It was really, spent too much time pretending it didn't happen, calling it something else, paying too much attention to what society calls it, and not enough attention to what it actually was. After a while, it starts to come out of you in different ways. You express the trauma differently. You view the world a little bit differently. It affects your relationships, both with people that you know and love and strangers. It affects your work. It has a big impact on a lot of things in your life. After a while, it was just time to deal with it. And my mind said, wake up and pay attention and do what you can to help yourself from this point forward.
Now, I have a story pulled up here that you wrote when you shared your story. I've got the T-shirt and the trauma response to go with it. You wrote this back in January earlier this year, and it's a pretty intense story. Were you in the military at the time?
Yes, I was. I was an active duty Marine at Camp Lejeune at the time, and she was a civilian living nearby.
And so when the rape happened, it was being in the military, active duty, and having been taken advantage of by a woman. Did that add to this element of I can't come out with this, I can't say anything? There's a sense of shame or blow to my masculinity in what occurred. And this gets back to the question I had asked Dean. Also, do you think if that's the case, is that the dynamic that really leads to the massive underreporting? Is the internalization for boys and men who've been assaulted and raped that they can't say anything less they're less of a man?
Yeah, definitely. There's this whole mentality that real men don't let these things bother them, and women are not capable of committing these types of acts. And if it happens to a man, well, then there must be something wrong with him. Or if a woman engages in such behavior, then something must have happened to her to cause her to do that. It takes away responsibility from the female predator, and then it dehumanizes the male survivor by making it seem as if he's the one that's really at fault, because why else would it bother him? Every man wants every woman at all times, period. Consent is a non-issue when you're talking about a man.
Yeah, and that touches. Oh yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead, Dean.
Well, that's nonsense. Consent is a non-issue. That just kind of presumes that boys have no emotions tied to sex. And I'm sorry, who actually believes that boys have no emotions when it comes to sex? I'm sorry, what boy doesn't have stories about getting his heart broken when he was a young man or whatever? And you get involved with some woman who's, you're 15, 16, even 17, or in that age range or younger, and you're with somebody that much older than you, that's almost a parent figure, and you draw from them what's normal and what not. You get involved. I got involved with a predator. Well, she didn't beat me, or anything, but it was the same stuff. Let's use drugs. Let's treat you like an adult. Let's get into kinky, weird sex. Let's treat you that's normal. Then you go on to other relationships, and you've measured what you think is normal based on the cues they gave you. We can we can be hurt. The whole idea that we are not vulnerable because we're male needs to be dispelled. And I would agree, by the way, it's like we have this widespread cultural blind spot. We assume innocence on the part of women. And it's, I
Yeah.
just saw a story in the news, like I was saying, of somebody who was cheering when a 35-year-old woman has sex with a 16-year-old boy who just immigrated to this country. The boy's a foreign exchange student. He's living with her. He gets kicked out of the house for having sex with the woman, and everybody's cheering and saying he's a hot young stud. No, he's not. That kid's damaged.
Yeah, and Wendy, I want to go to you about this as a psychotherapist who deals with this issue. How do you respond to the story Dean just said?
Well, the first thing I want to say to all the men on the panel today is you're so brave and you're doing absolutely the right thing. And I love how articulately you're explaining this crime. And it's true that we have a very narrow definition in our culture of male sexuality. And we assume that boys are men. And then we assume the other myth that men don't connect feelings with sex. Now, we do know there are some men in our culture who can certainly have sex and have no emotions connected with it. But for the most part, men use sex to bond with women just as other people do. And the stories that you're telling about the trauma that you experience are very real. And the fact that the predators in our culture are regarded as somehow, they're not at fault because they were damaged or they didn't mean to do it. But it's very real and highly underreported because the boys feel shame and confusion, as you mentioned, and the predators don't think that they're committing a crime. So and they're unheard even when the boys do speak out. It's very real and it's very, I'm so glad we're having this conversation today.
So Wendy, we have this story that Dean had told us about a school teacher. Another story here, I have pulled up a recent story from HuffPost. Stephanie Fletcher, former Walton, New York teacher, accused of having sex with students during class breaks. So what's the mentality? What's the dynamic that's going on that compels this proto-stereotypical story we always hear about a school teacher with the students?
Well, when I try to explain the psychological dynamics involved, please don't interpret it as I'm forgiving the person because of these other environmental factors were at play. But I want you to understand that there are plenty of teachers, especially young ones in their 20s, who are almost barely out of adolescence themselves. They get into an environment of emerging sexuality with adolescents, lots of pheromones, lots of hormones, everything going around, and their brain starts to become diluted into thinking that they're actually an adolescent as well. And when I hear about, say, a 27-year-old teacher who's with a 16-year-old, captain of the football team, there is a piece of her mind that's forgotten that she's the adult here. She's forgotten that wisdom and has actually gone into a place of, wow, I'm a high school girl and I got the head of the football team. So again, this explanation is certainly not meant to dismiss the crime, but it's helping. We should, as a culture, start to understand when you put young adults or even older adults in environments with lots of adolescents, and you don't talk about the emerging sexual issues, and you don't talk about boundaries, and you don't enforce and reinforce all the boundaries that has to happen, you can make environments unsafe for kids.
Yeah, Wendy, we wouldn't be having this conversation if this were a 27-year-old male teacher with a 16-year-old girl, now would we? And if we're going to be in a society where we talk about equality between the sexes, that includes holding women to the same standards we hold men to on these things, I would think.
Yeah, and we have a comment from Ordo that says, we create this dichotomy because of misandry. Women beautiful, men ugly, women innocent, men guilty, women harmless, men dangerous, women good, men evil. Societally, we've lumped evil with men, so women are not taken seriously in a negative way. I think that might be a bit of a too broad statement, but it's touching on something we're hearing here, right? About this either internalization by male victims that they should be proud that they've been introduced into this world of heterosexual sex versus this idea that women should feel victimized when they are rightly victimized, but men shouldn't have that sense themselves. And I want to go back to Curtis also with this. There's a tweet that your organization put out saying for U.S. male population in 2009, diabetes 15 million, heart disease 19 million, sexual abuse survivors 25 to 30 million.
Yeah, that's right. You're talking about 1 in 6 men. Every 1 in 6 men go to the mall and start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bam. And that's a lot of people out there that are suffering, and mostly are suffering in silence.
Yeah, and James, how have you really reset your life, adjusted yourself, come to terms with your being a sexual assault and rape survivor?
Well, the first thing I had to do was just stop listening to people on the internet as much as possible.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
You don't need
idiots
those
out there.
calls.
Yep.
Well, I'll
And
let
I
you know
just
that the
had to accept
commenters
it.
we have in HuffPost Live are being very respectful, and I think they're definitely worth listening to here. They're saying you guys are excellent, and they're really happy to hear your stories.
Yep. Thank you. So yeah, one thing I did was I stopped paying attention to people who told you that you couldn't be heard, you didn't have a right to feel anything over this, that something was wrong with you if you did. I knew that that wasn't the case. I sought out a counselor, started asking questions, and started processing through all of the emotions and everything that I had ignored for so long. That was one of the first things I had to do. I had to stop letting other people tell me how I was allowed to feel. And that takes a lot of work. And it, in some cases, pisses people off. And that's what you got to do, you know?
And you and Dean both mentioned that you had trust issues with women. Did that impact your relationships, and how are your relationships with women now?
Well, I am still married. I've been married for 18 years, and so there's that. I work in human resources, so my peers are almost always women. I've had females working for me, and it's just taken a little bit of time to make sure that I'm okay, that I'm not sending off signals to them, you know, to make them think that I'm afraid of them or that I don't trust them. So I've had to do a lot of internal work on myself to try to make sure that I'm also treating women fairly and not holding them responsible for something that another woman did.
Right. And how about you, Dean?
Honestly, I was going to make a joke about how I now hate all women, but no, nothing like that is true. I guess I've been fortunate, and I have many very good and positive relationships with women. I have looked back on the past on some things and realized I had some weird boundary issues there that I know I had inherited from that experience, like what's appropriate, what's not, all that. I guess we all have those confusions when we're younger. I think it took me a lot longer to process. I don't know if James went through this. Maybe he did. I had seen therapists before for issues like depression and things like that. And I'd had more than, and this is something I'd mentioned to Wendy, I'd had more than one counselor, therapist ask me about my early sexual experiences. I mentioned one of my earliest ones was with a 30-year-old woman, a woman in her 30s when I was a young teenager, and they just didn't even think, they weren't even curious about it.
Amazing.
They weren't even curious about it.
I think
Like,
that's
that must have been
ethically
interesting.
reportable. I actually think that's ethically reportable as a crime against children.
Well, yeah, I would get it.
What state and whether how many years have passed, but I think the onus is on the therapist to report if they hear those kinds of stories.
Well, usually I never brought it up until it was many years later, and they'd be like, "Well, how did you feel about that?" And I'd be like, "Oh, it was exciting." But they weren't curious enough to dig. And I wonder sometimes as therapists just aren't digging and asking and zooming in on this question because they assume it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
I eventually looked into seeing a therapist who's actually been sexually abused himself, and he's like, "Dean, we really should talk about this." And you're not, you're probably right. We probably should. So.
Yeah. And we have a comment here from Amelia POK saying, I have a friend who was molested by his aunt at a young age, and to this day, he has never been faithful to a woman and is constantly looking for a new conquest.
Well, that's pretty typical. What happens is when someone who's sexually abused by male or female, they grow up with low self-esteem issues, and a lot of times they get into a relationship and they don't like themselves. So at first it's cool when people say, "Oh, I love you," and you're a good person, but eventually, if we don't like ourselves, then we start to think that that person must be a liar, and we start to push those that we love away. And a lot of times we don't feel deserving of that love, so we oftentimes go other places to find it. That's pretty typical.
Oh,
Can I just say,
that
I
hurt.
one thing about
Wendy, can I ask you to hold your
sure.
your microphone closer to your mouth as well, so we can hear you a little bit better?
Well, I think I'm just using my iPad here.
Oh, okay.
The iPad with the mic, so whatever mic is there. Hope I don't have my hand over it.
Oh, no, you sound great now.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is You know, there is a lot of misunderstanding about what rape of a boy or an adolescent or a young man is, because we assume that the weapon in rape is always something physical, violence, the threat of violence, but the weapons in rape can simply be power, a power dynamic over somebody. The weapons of rape can be drugs or alcohol. And sadly, I think it was touched on earlier, is that our bodies operate separately from our psyche. So even though there's a piece of you inside, and every rape victim obviously has a large piece that's saying, no, 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 your body may still respond to physical stimulation. And that's the really confusing thing for
Yeah.
victims,
And
because their body's actually telling them it's pleasure, but at the same time, they're feeling awful feelings inside.
yeah, and I know,
It
Curtis,
goes back to
you had
what I just
mentioned. Curtis, you had mentioned that, or sorry, not Curtis, Dean, you had mentioned that you were a runaway and were almost groomed by the woman who took you in. But James, you were drugged, right?
Yes, she bought me a couple drinks, and the last one pretty much did me in. Started getting hazy, didn't know what was going on. Two drinks was not my max to put me out under the table. Um, I was in great. I was in pretty good shape. I was, U.S. Marine. Um, two drink was not enough to do it. So she had to put something in the drink, and especially with the memory issues I had in the morning and the disorientation, all those things going on. I don't know if she had just planned to get anyone that night, and I just happened to be convenient, or if there was something more to it. She certainly pulled it off as if it's something she's done before and was comfortable doing.
And what was the dynamic when you woke up and saw what was happening with you? Was there any way to get out of it? Was there a power dynamic there as well?
Yeah, there was definitely a power dynamic there. Well, for one, she was pregnant, so then you're dealing with the unborn child, and you had to be careful in that regard. Not to mention that she informed me that I better not be forceful, and I was expected basically just to lay there and take it. And when I did try to move, she accused me of trying to hurt the baby, and then she threw it back on me as if I was the one assaulting her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was. I mean, she was completely in control. On top of the fact that I was disoriented after waking up and didn't really know what was going on, who she was, or what had happened the night before. It took a while to piece all that together.
Well, that's a horrifying story, and I feel like now we need to know really what you can say to those who are watching and those who may watch this in the future who've endured a similar trauma, how to find his way out of it.
Well, I would say, for one, don't doubt yourself. Date rape drugs are really difficult to dig out of that fog. There's going to be things I may never ever remember. I put together some things over the years. It's taken a lot of work on that, and connecting the dots. But if you find yourself in that kind of a situation, you're going to have to assess your own safety and make your decision based on what's going on at that time. I chose not to fight back. One, I wasn't going to hurt that child. I wasn't going to hurt her. It was lose-lose for me no matter what I did. She had already raped me at that point because that had happened during the night, and then she was continuing it on when she got back on top of me in the morning. It wasn't something I was going to walk away from. It was already in progress. So I made the decision to not harm anybody in the process of defending myself. And you have to make your own decision based on what's going on at the time. But the thing to not do is doubt yourself. Let other people tell you, oh, it's not that bad. These are all individual instances, and nothing is the same for any survivor.
Yeah.
No attack is the same. No reaction is the same.
Don't ever, ask any doctor. Don't believe anybody who tries to tell you that an erection is a voluntary thing. We act like that. You had a hard on. You may have even ejaculated. Therefore, you must have been enjoying what was going on, right? Right? Yeah, fuck you. No. And not only are they not even all of that voluntary, but there's things you can do physically to force an erection on a guy, especially if he's drugged. And it just hurts me listening to this because I'm like, you're right. I can see the situation you're in. It's like you could hurt her, and if you do, you're going to be called a rapist and an assaulter that's what would have happened to you, sir. I really feel for what you went through. I went through it as a child.
Bind. He was put in a very serious double bind. Damned if he did, damned if he didn't. And he was trying to figure out what is the gentlemanly way to get out of this terrible, terrible situation. You know, you mentioned earlier too something about boundaries. Of course, we shouldn't expect anyone who has a power dynamic above them to be exerting huge boundaries because they often can't, especially if they're young. But I really think that part of how we raise our children is to teach them to grow up to be adults who can exert their own boundaries, who feel comfortable telling people where the boundaries are, acting them out behaviorally. In fact, in my forthcoming book called The 30-Day Love Detox, I have an entire chapter on how to say no to sex. Because I've learned that many women, for instance, don't even know they'll go through it just to get out the door because they don't know how to properly say no.
Well, I want to just show on my computer screen here a comment from D Moore at 2590, a link to a website dealing with male abuse, toysoldier.wordpress.com. We also have Curtis's site. We also have, Dean, your organization, right?
A Voice for Men, yeah, we talk about a number of men's rights related issues. This is certainly one of them, and people are welcome to come aboard. We're a little feisty, but everybody is welcome. Everybody of all sexes are welcome.
And Wendy, I also want to come to you and say that, you know, we're talking about male victims of female sexual assault and rape, but there's also female victims of sexual assault and rape.
Of course, both genders can become victims. Both genders can be perpetrators. So, you know, it knows no gender. This kind of, but you know, I also wanted to add, we live right now in a very dangerous time for our young people of both genders because we live in what I call a high supply sexual economy, where sexual opportunity has risen exponentially, especially online, and sexual restraint and sexual boundaries seem to have been decreased. And we sort of laugh at these cougar women and think it's so cool that they're cougars. And I'm like, what? They're supposed to be a great grandmother or a mother right now, not running around lusting after their teenage son's friends. I mean, it's ludicrous, but it's all part of this high supply sexual economy that we're in right now.
And I do want to say that everything we've been talking about in the last half hour does not do anything to downplay or minimize the prevalence of male on male or male on female sexual assault and rape. We're just trying to bring light to female on male or female on female sexual assault and rape. I have a comment here from Paul Ilam saying, I have 20 years of counseling experience. I can tell you that the possibility of sexual abuse in the personal history of men is given nowhere near the attention that is given to women. So Curtis, I'd just like to ask you to round this off and tell me a little about what you guys are doing and what you've seen and what you'd like to tell our audience.
Well, this is a great, what you're doing is amazing because it's only recently where the media stopped calling these guys lucky. And even as early as a few years ago, I heard Jon Stewart talk about Mary Kay Letourneau and said, we'll call her Mary Kay and we'll call him Lucky. I called that producer and he said, hey, that's comedy. And I said, it's not comedy. And but we're making a lot of strides here, and the organization is working. You guys are doing a great job. I just want to throw in a quick story really quick. I work in a program that works with inmates at the local jail, and it's a group of 50 guys, violent offenders, and I started talking about female offenders, and one guy says, wait, if a woman comes on to me and I go through with it and I say no and she keeps going and we have sex, then I was raped by a woman? And I said, yeah. And he says, and he's working it. I was raped by a woman? I was raped by a woman. And everyone laughs. I said, no, that's why men don't tell. And at the same time, the gentlemen on either side of him raised their hands, each separately, and said, me too. This is such a big deal, and hardly anybody knows about it. But I got to commend you and the entire panel for getting the word out there. It's amazing.
Well, Curtis, Dean, James, Wendy, thank you guys for joining. Dean, you've been throwing a bunch of links in our comments section, as have others as well. So I want to thank you guys and everyone who's participating at home, at work, wherever they are in the comments section. We really appreciate it. In your cars even, thank you, Wendy. So guys, thank you. I hope that we can continue hearing your work and your stories in a way to make this world a better place. This is HuffPost Live. The conversation will continue.